Good day. Last 24 hours on the Ukrainian battlefields have seen a much quieter situation on the southern front lines and renewed Ukrainian attacks in the Bakhmut area, with at the same time steady advances by the Russians, but incremental and undramatic in the northern front lines around Kupiansk, where the fighting is considerably less intense than it is further south. Now, yesterday, I said in my video that there was some reason to think that on the crucial Orekhov area, the Ukrainians have moved onto the defense, that they've had to pull back some of their best troops, the 82nd Brigade, to the rear to rest and refit and re-equip and reinforce after extremely heavy losses, that the gap has now been filled by the 71st Jaeger Brigade. This is all according to the Russian Ministry of Defense, but that for the moment it is the Russians who hold the initiative in this area, in the area of Rabotino, Verbovoye, in the Orekhov direction, as both sides refer to it. And for what it's worth, the reports that were trickling out yesterday tended to support this. They suggested that, in fact, Ukraine has perhaps not gone over entirely to the defensive in this area, but has basically stopped making attempts to break through. The troops of the 82nd Brigade, who were the ones who were perhaps principally focused with trying to break through to Verbovoye, have indeed been pulled back, and that the Russians have launched flanking attacks around this area which the Ukrainians advanced into, this salient that has been created into this area, and that they've actually quietly gained ground or regained ground in this area. And there's even a report which says that Ukrainian troops have been given orders that they're not to retreat from their positions, which again seems to confirm that there's been a general shift in the situation from attack towards defense. This is, of course, the area which the United States and Britain see as the primary axis, where more than 2 weeks ago now, 2.5 weeks ago now, there were all those claims in the media in the West and to some extent in Ukraine about the Ukrainians having achieved a breakthrough, having pushed through the first line of the Russian defense. There was even one report in the Daily Telegraph, I remember, which claimed that the Ukrainians had now approached the second line of defense. As Brian Beletic pointed out in one of the programs that we did with him recently on the Duran, I think it was on the Duran, it might have been on his own channel. Anyway, as he pointed out, the Western media, Western commentators take a very flexible approach in their definition of where the first line of the Russian defense lies. Sometimes they imply that it is the Surovikin line, and of course there were some suggestions at one point that they had pierced it. Other times it is the advanced trenches in the zone of control, which the Russians have created around Rabotino and in other places, with the Surovikin line suddenly becoming the second defense line. Anyway, putting all that to one side, there was all those euphoric stories about 2.5 weeks ago. The reality is that there's been no breakthrough. The Surovikin line has not been pierced or breached. The Ukrainians may have reached it in a few places, but they've certainly not broken through it. Rabotino remains contested, and I noticed that Boris Rozhin, one of the Russian commentators, said that the Russians still control and occupy the southern part of Rabotino, and that most of this village is in the grey zone, in other words, it's contested, and they remain in complete control of Verbovoye. So a quieter situation there, and apparently it's also a reasonably quiet situation near Piatichatki, further to the west, and in the Vremevka salient area. As I discussed in my program yesterday, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense, there have been intense Ukrainian attacks in that area over the previous week, but they've achieved nothing. They've not managed to advance at all. All those losses in men and machines, men killed and wounded in machines as well, has resulted in no progress. And it seems, at least the latest reports suggest, that the situation there has become quieter. Now, there are rumours of something brewing further west still. In Kherson region, the Russians launched a major missile and bombing attack on Kherson region west of the Dnieper River, and there continues to be fighting in the various islands in the Dnieper River, with the Ukrainians trying to gain control of some of these islands, being counterattacked by the Russians launching airstrikes and mortar attacks and such things on the Ukrainian troops in the Dnieper River. But perhaps the most interesting thing is that the Ukrainians, according to one Russian source, which is Rybar, whose absolute accuracy sometimes has been contested, but I find that in most of his reports, actually, he's pretty reliable. Anyway, Rybar says that the Ukrainians have been putting together, assembling in Kherson region, units to which they've given names like Normandy, Omaha, and whatever, obviously referencing back to the Normandy operation of June 1944, the successful Allied landings in Normandy in June 1944 that marked the return of the Western Allies to the war in Northern Europe. Well, it could be that, or it could be that Rybar is wrong about this and he's been misled by chatter, or it could be that the Ukrainians are not really planning any major strike across the Dnieper. I've seen it suggested that realistically this isn't achievable until and unless the Ukrainians in the Zaporozhye region achieve a breakthrough towards Tokmak and arguably beyond, and of that, of course, we see no sign. But anyway, it could be that the Ukrainians are nonetheless planning such an assault across the Dnieper, or it could be that they really have given names to these units, and it's really more a case of making the Russians believe that there is such a possibility, so as to draw Russian defences to this area rather than to have them concentrated in more important areas around Orekhov. Well, I'm not going to spend more time speculating, I simply don't know. Anyway, the reality, as I said, is that the major Ukrainian attacks have instead been in the Bakhmut area. And of course, this goes diametrically against the advice Ukraine has been receiving from the United States and from Britain. The US has always been skeptical, both about the defense of Bakhmut before its final fall in May, and they have been also deeply skeptical about Ukraine's attempts to launch an offensive in this particular area. And as I discussed about a month ago, there was a apparently rather difficult, rather heated meeting between General Zaluzhny, the Ukrainian overall military commander, and General Mark Milley of the United States, was General Karoli, and Admiral Radakin of NATO and of Britain also present, in which the Western powers insisted that Ukraine stop this offensive in Bakhmut, concentrate its forces, to break through in the all-important Orechov area. As far as the West is concerned, this remains the zone of destiny. This is where the great breakthrough must be achieved. Isolating or even recapturing Crimea is the way to win this war quickly and decisively. And supposedly Zaluzhny tried to push back at this meeting, even though he's known to have had doubts about the Bakhmut defense and offensive himself in the past. But anyway, he then appeared to agree. And then there were reports that the situation in the Bakhmut area had quieted and that the Ukrainian troops had indeed been withdrawn from the Bakhmut area and were indeed going to be concentrated on the Zaporozhye front lines. And then the fighting around Bakhmut continued as usual. And as I have pointed out, from Russian Ministry of Defense reports, which get published every day, sometimes more than once a day, what we can actually see is that so far as the Russian Ministry of Defense is concerned, so far as its reporting is concerned, the heaviest Ukrainian losses anywhere on the battlefronts, and therefore, by implication, the most intense fighting, at least for the last few weeks, continues to be in the Bakhmut area. Far from scaling down its operations in this area, Ukraine is intensifying them. It has been repeatedly pushing harder to try to reverse the Russian gains of the spring in this area, to at least re-enter Bakhmut or recapture Bakhmut or something of that kind. And the Russian Ministry of Defense, in its bulletin yesterday, also seemed to indicate some puzzlement about this. I've seen Russian commentators also talk about this as being a senseless offensive that Ukraine is conducting. And of course, as I've said already, the Americans and the British seem to be skeptical about this offensive. In fact, they're not so much skeptical as outright hostile to it, but Ukraine persists with it. And yesterday was a particularly intense day of attacks. In fact, yesterday was the culmination of a series of very intense Ukrainian attacks on the flanks, as it's put, of the north and south of Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut. It seems clear that in the Berkhovka area to the north, the Ukrainian attacks were totally unsuccessful. Apparently, once more, the landscape around this small village to the north of, well, shall we call it Bakhmut, is littered with dead bodies and burnt out vehicles as a result of a failed Ukrainian attack. But the main attack, again, seems to have been on the southern flank towards Klishayevka and Kurdyumovka. And there were reports yesterday that the Ukrainians managed to gain some ground in Klishayevka, which, however, continues to be disputed. This village fought over intensely ever since the start of Ukrainian offensive operations in this area at the beginning of May. Anyway, it seems that this village has been all but destroyed. The Ukrainians have some troops in some parts of the village. The Russians have troops in other parts. Most of the reports agree, at least the ones that I consider to be reliable, that the village, most of the village now is in the grey zone. In other words, it's becoming another Pyatikhatki, another Rabotino, another Staromayorsk, one of those places that's been continuously fought over, effectively destroyed, and which, since there is no cover, neither side can establish a permanent presence, because whenever they try, they are the subject of heavy artillery strikes. And the same is true of that other much smaller village. It's not even a village, a hamlet, Andreevka, which the Ukrainians claimed some weeks ago that they'd captured, and then of course it turned out that was wrong, and then there were more Ukrainian claims that they'd captured this village a couple of days ago, except it turned out that those reports were wrong, and then there were more reports the day before yesterday that the Ukrainians had captured Andreevka all over again, and there were even some really astonishing claims that an entire brigade of the Russian army had been encircled and destroyed by the Ukrainian troops in Andreevka. And various people, like Big Serge on Twitter, have pointed out that these claims are not only false, they are manifestly absurd. Andreevka, tiny hamlet, apparently without a church, it's so small. Apparently this little place, basically a few houses and a few fields, is supposed to have been occupied by an entire brigade of the Russian army, which supposedly was destroyed there almost to a man. Anyway, there have been lots of other reports about what has really happened in Andreevka, and it is quite different and far less dramatic. This tiny place has also been destroyed. It seems most of the troops, Russian troops who are fighting there, come from the 106th Airborne Guards Division. In other words, they're paratroopers. There are also Chechen fighters further north, apparently in the Klishevka area. So these are high-quality Russian troops defending this place. The brigade that was supposed to be destroyed, by the way, was the 72nd Brigade, a rather mysterious brigade, first referenced by Yevgeny Prigozhin all the way back in May or early June, after the Wagner forces withdrew from Bakhmut. There was puzzlement at that time as to this particular brigade, about its existence. There's been speculation whether it exists or doesn't ever since. But anyway, the reality is that this particular area is defended not by troops, so this may be imaginary brigade, but by paratroopers, Russian paratroopers of the 106th Airborne Guards Division, and they are providing on-the-spot reports now. They say that the village, Andreevka, the hamlet, is also entirely destroyed. There isn't a single building left standing there. There's no cover. They can enter it from time to time and do. The Ukrainians can enter it from time to time and do. But there is no cover for anybody, any troops that try to organize themselves there are exposed immediately to intense Russian artillery fire, and the result is that in all respects this village is in the grey zone, and Ukrainian advances in this particular area have also therefore achieved very little, despite strenuous attempts and a very heavy loss of life. Now, I'm going to suggest that the primary purpose of these Ukrainian attacks now, Klishevka, places like Klishevka and Andreevka, was to provide Zelensky with at least something that he could pass off as good news when he goes to New York. He can't, for the UN General Assembly session, and then moves on to Washington, D.C. for his meetings with the US officials. He cannot talk about a breakthrough to the Sea of Azov. The breakthrough towards Tokmak isn't going to happen. Time is running short for that. We're now in the second half of September. Ukrainian forces have failed to break through in the main front lines in the south. So he's renewed his attempts, or rather the Ukrainians have renewed their attempts to achieve something that they can define as progress here on the Bakhmut front, but so far they have failed in that attempt. And in fact, we've have a comment from a Russian soldier. He's spoken to TASS. He's apparently a volunteer from a Cossack unit that is located in the Bakhmut area. And he said that what is typical of our defence is very active work of the enemy's artillery, especially recently. At night, there is the enemy's large movement and concentration of equipment and forces. At night, you can hear the buzz of heavy equipment, such as tanks, armoured personnel carriers, and motor vehicles. We are currently on the defence, getting ready to repel attacks if they're attempted in our area. They are constantly trying to probe the location of our weaponry. We feel or expect certain offensive actions in our area. And Tassin goes on to say that he added that in other areas where the Ukrainians are attempting to advance, they do not have any particular results. So they may be seeking new areas where they hope to get some effect from offensive operations. And I'm sure that's right. As I said, they haven't succeeded on the southern front lines, so there's been this desperate attempt to try to achieve some kind of advance, some sort of breakthrough on the northern, in the front lines around Bakhmut. And it isn't just about impressing people in New York and Washington. There's been a most interesting article in the Daily Telegraph about flagging morale in Ukraine. Now, the Daily Telegraph is, of course, a newspaper that is fervently supportive of Ukraine, as all the other big British media outlets are. But the title of the article, I'm not going to read the rest of it, but it says, "Mood sours in Ukraine as it braces for a long and bloody war. Army is still advancing, but painfully slowly against an entrenched Russian enemy protected by minefields." And further on in the article, there is a comment from a Ukrainian officer, this is a Ukrainian officer speaking off the record, but he spoke about the toll that attacking across minefields against well-dug-in defenders without air cover has taken on his company. The men replacing those who had fallen, he added, lacked the same level of training and motivation. If the war drags on for 1 or 2 more years, the strain on Ukraine's limited human resources could become immense. That's what this officer says. So he's talking about a war of 1 or 2 years, but he says that Ukraine simply cannot afford that war. It cannot afford a long attrition war. And though elsewhere in the article, the reporters from the Daily Telegraph talk about the Ukrainians remaining defiant, that morale may be falling, but it has not cracked. They still want to battle on until victory, supposedly. But anyway, notwithstanding all of these brave words, it still remains the case that morale in Ukraine is falling. And of course, the article tells us this. Mood sours in Ukraine as it braces for a long and bloody war. Now, this article that I just quoted from the Daily Telegraph has achieved a certain amount of attention. It was up on the website, the Daily Telegraph's website, on the front page for a while. Lots of people picked it up. Another, I thought, in some ways even more revealing article in the Daily Telegraph from on-the-spot reporters who are close to the front line. These are people like Richard Oliphant. He's not there actually on the front line, but anyway, he's been able to talk to some of the soldiers who are. Anyway, this other article has received far less attention. I suspect because, as I noticed, it was only up on the Daily Telegraph's front page of its website for a relatively short time, just a few hours. It was there and then it was gone. It doesn't mean that it's been cancelled. You can still find it in the Daily Telegraph if you search for it. But anyway, this is what the headline of this article says. And by the way, let me correct, it's Roland Oliphant, not Richard Oliphant. Ukraine liberates territory tree by tree after critical tactical shift. Troops describe the brutal realities of close quarters combat as they push south in the counteroffensive. Now, just take a step back and think about that headline. Ukraine liberates territory tree by tree. This from the same newspaper that just 2-3 weeks ago was talking about a breakthrough on the southern front lines, that the offensive was gaining momentum, that it was going to accelerate. In fact, they're only advancing, according to the headline, tree by tree. And we actually go on to read elsewhere in the article that Ukraine's counteroffensive in the Zaporozhye region began more than 3 months ago. The objective was to reach the Sea of Azov, about 50 miles to the south. Actually, I think it's a bit further away than that, but never mind. If successful, it would have divided Russia's occupying army in two and isolated Crimea, dramatically reversing the strategic balance and possibly ending the war. But it has not gone to plan. An admission that things are not going to plan. There's been some attempts to say that, people had expectations too high, that the offensive was advancing slowly, but this is always, as might have been predicted. It doesn't mean that the offensive itself has failed. Well, here we see this article in the Daily Telegraph, and it's admitting what is in effect a failure. The plan for the offensive operation did not work out. It has not gone to plan. And then the article goes on to say, armoured thrusts intended to break through the Russian front line quickly became bogged down in minefields. There's a lot more dramatic than that. Huge numbers of armoured vehicles were destroyed. We've all seen the pictures. And by the way, they continue to be destroyed, though further away from the front lines. And there's even a report that the British were very unhappy about the destruction of the two Challenger two tanks. Of course, they've only admitted to the destruction of one, and that there's been a decision taken by Ukraine that the Leopard 2s and the Challenger 2s, and perhaps before long the Abrams tanks, will not be deployed on the front lines anymore. They will not conduct armoured advances. They will be used instead as artillery, as some form of artillery. Now, I understand that the Challenger 2, with its rifled gun, which is fairly long range and precise at long ranges, can be used at that way. The Leopard 2 and the Abrams, with their smoothbore, high-velocity guns, can't. But anyway, that's apparently the plan. We keep the Leopard 2s and the Abrams and the Challenger 2s out of trouble. We can't afford any more pictures of them burning on the steppes. And then, to return to the Telegraph article, it says that after initial results led to heavy losses, Ukraine's generals changed tactics. Blitzkrieg was paused. They are now concentrating on degrading Russian artillery and logistics, whilst small groups of infantry claw their way forward, tree line by tree line. And this, of course, brings me back to that article by Professor Mearsheimer that I've discussed recently about the fact that Blitzkrieg, well, more often than not, it fails. Can't help but suspect that the authors of this article, through their reference to Blitzkrieg, are not, shall we say, entirely unfamiliar with Professor Mearsheimer's article. But anyway, never mind, let's move on. And we see how the infantry now, the small groups of infantry, that they're clawing their way forward, tree line by tree line. And then we're told that it has resulted in some progress. Late last month, the Ukrainians finally captured Rabotino, a village a few miles south of the initial starting line. That was meant to fall in the early stages of the assault. Except, as I've already said, it hasn't fallen. There are still Russian troops on the outskirts. Ukraine doesn't control it, but never mind. But that was, of course, presented as the breakthrough, and then we're told they're now expanding the salient to the southeast and west. Well, it is absolutely the case that they have been trying to expand their area of control. By the way, there's a map attached to this article which shows Rabotino in, I am confident, entirely the wrong place. Never mind, it suggests either that my eyesight is particularly defective or that this map is wrong in some way. But I'm not going to discuss Rabotino further in this article. Suffice to say that the Ukrainians have not controlled it. But anyway, they have indeed been trying to expand this salient, but they've not been making any success so far. They've not been able to capture Verbovoye. And then the article says, but the advance is still painfully slow, and casualties, although not officially reported, are believed to have been high. So there it is, tree by tree, tree line by tree line. Clearly no great breakthrough, heavy losses to achieve progress on very limited ground. Now, there's been an interesting article in, of all places, USA Today. Not a place I go to much, I have to admit. I should say that I know of this article because Jeff Roberts, the historian, has circulated his indispensable collection of articles. He's provided links to them. One of those fortunate to be on his mailing list. And I just wanted to again express my thanks to him for doing that. But anyway, this article actually provides what I think is one of the most interesting correctives and overviews about the actual real situation in the war. It says, the title is Ukraine in Deep Trouble. Some experts say $1 billion more from US. Won't matter. That's a reference to the money that was being provided by Blinken. And then we have commentaries by two US military officers. And this was in response to Secretary of State Blinken's claim, whilst in Kiev a short time ago, that progress with Ukraine's counteroffensive has accelerated in the past few weeks, and that the new aid package will help sustain it and build further momentum. And then we have comments like this from Stephen Myers, an Air Force veteran, State Department Advisory Panel member and Russia expert, says the Biden administration party line is that Ukraine is winning and that Russia must yield to the West or become a vassal of China. Come to that soon. Myers says new Ukrainian Defense Minister Rustem Umerov, a Blinken pat on the back, and the latest aid package won't dramatically alter Ukraine's struggle against its far bigger neighbour. There is no effective counter-strategy available to the Ukrainians, Myers said. The Ukrainians are in deep trouble. Myers told USA Today the Ukrainians use pinpricks. I've used that expression. He's referring to the drone and missile attacks that Ukraine launches in various places at various times. Myers told USA Today the Ukrainians use pinpricks and news about taking back land to demonstrate progress up to the West, but are less transparent about the cost in Ukrainian lives. They don't talk about the counterstrikes by the Russians, who don't care about gaining or holding ground in the kill zone, places like Robotino, Klashayevka, Andreevka, Staromayorsk, Pyatikhatki, etc., who don't care about Russians, who don't care about gaining or holding ground in the kill zone and are experts at laying traps. Now, way back last year, much earlier in the war, there was a US Marine Corps officer who wrote a very interesting piece for the US Marine Corps General, and he spoke about how the Russians are very skilled at creating firebags for the Ukrainians, luring the Ukrainians into firebags where they can be heavily shelled by Russian artillery and have massive casualties inflicted upon them. And we've seen this tactic, in fact, used in the conflict again and again by the Russians as they continue to wage attrition. And to repeat, here we see it once more from Stephen Myers. The Russians don't care about gaining or holding ground in the kill zone and are experts at laying traps. If you go to the new atlas, to what Brian Beletic has been saying, you will know that also. Brian has repeatedly made the point that the Russians are not obsessed with holding on to every millimetre of territory. The Ukrainians are, and suffer horrendous casualties doing so. The Russians are not. They are prepared to pull back in places when it suits them, and it works to their advantage as they create fire traps. It works to their advantage in the war of attrition that they are fighting. And then we actually have some detail. Ukrainian forays into Russian territory usually result in drones smashing high-rise windows in Moscow. A Russian rocket attack Wednesday on the eastern city of Konstantinovka struck a downtown market, killing 17 civilians hours after Blinken arrived in Kiev. Now, actually, the Russians are disputing that they were responsible for the deaths, the civilian deaths in Konstantinovka. They suggest it might have been, again, an air defense missile, the Ukrainian air defense missile, falling to earth. I'm not going to get into the details of this. I don't know. But the point that's being made here is absolutely valid. These pinprick attacks on Ukraine, by Ukraine on Russia, sometimes they can cause some hurt. There was the attack on the airfield near Pskov, which resulted in 2 Ilyushin-76 aircraft being destroyed. There was this more recent attack on this naval yard in Sevastopol, where an amphibious ship was damaged and a Russian Navy submarine was also damaged. We don't know the extent of the damage to either vessel. I've seen all kinds of claims. I don't think anybody apart from the Russians can realistically say. But if you put that aside, none of the Ukrainian attacks have come close to the kind of damage that the Russians are doing on Ukraine day after day, week after week, with the British Defence Ministry now talking about the Russians stockpiling missiles, large numbers of missiles, with a view to launching some kind of big missile offensive, perhaps against Ukraine's energy system, over the course of the winter. And then USA Today goes on to say that Ukraine and the West badly need an exit strategy, Myers said. Europe is in more economic trouble than we are. Germany is in deep recession. The Europeans are not going to shoulder more economic burden. They need an off-ramp. And then we have a long article. Then we have a further comments from Sean McFate, a professor at Syracuse University and senior fellow at the non-partisan Atlantic Council think tank, and he aligns with Myers. He supports the change in defence ministers, saying corruption claims force the issue, but that won't change the course of the war. McFate says the United States relied on conventional warfare tactics in Vietnam, Iraq and Afghanistan and lost. Yet the United States has not changed tactics in Ukraine. Russia made the same mistakes early in Ukraine with its ill-fated blitz towards Kiev. Now the Kremlin is relying on more modern tools of war, such as controlling information and mercenary troops. Things are going nowhere for Ukraine. Wars are no longer won like World War II by taking the enemy's land, killing their troops and flying your flag over the capital. Well, that's from USA Today. There's been another very long piece by another US military officer, or I should say retired military officer, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, in 1945. He talks about the West needing to prepare for the possibility that the Ukrainian military might collapse. He said that Western officials are in denial about this possibility. His article is very careful, very measured. It gives Ukraine and the West every possible benefit of the doubt. He still hopes that says it's possible Ukraine might win. It's possible the war may be drawn out. It's possible it might end in a stalemate. But he acknowledges that there is now a real possibility, a real chance of a sudden Ukrainian collapse. Not different, not so very different in some ways from the one which happened in 2021 in Afghanistan. And he says that the West is not taking that possibility, though it is a real one, seriously. It's not absorbing the scale of Russia's preparations, the fact that the Russians are adapting and evolving and learning all the time from the way that they conduct the war, that their forces are modernizing and are improving, and their tactics and strategies are improving, and of course that they have a far bigger industrial and military base than Ukraine has, and a far bigger manpower reserve than Ukraine has, and that all of these things taken together open the way eventually for the Russians to go on the attack, and that it is far from certain that Ukraine with all the enormous losses that it is suffering, is going to be able to withstand this attack. So at least Daniel Davis is addressing this issue of a possible Ukrainian collapse, but he complains that no Western government is prepared to go there. No Western government is prepared to talk about that possibility. And his article, for those who are interested, is referred to Imagining the Unimaginable, what happens if Ukraine can't beat Russia. And as I said, it's been published in 1945. Now, another place where there have been big articles, interesting articles, has been the national interest. The national interest, one of that triad of big, heavyweight foreign policy dedicated magazines, alongside Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy. National interest, perhaps slightly less authoritative than the others, but nonetheless widely seen as something of a heavyweight. Anyway, there have been two interesting articles in it recently, one about F-16s, and it says that F-16s are too little, too late for Ukraine, pilot training delays, lack of necessary support infrastructure and resources, waning opportunities for effective employment will prevent the jets from changing the course of the war. So the result is that this business of the F-16s has been overhyped. It's not going to make any difference. A few dozen jets under the current conditions of the war cannot make an effective breakthrough. This reality is compounded by the fact that the enemy retains a well-equipped air force and anti-air missiles. With or without the jets, Ukraine's counteroffensive will remain slow on the ground and in the skies. And this is based on the assumption that Ukraine will continue to be on the offensive in the summer of next year, when the F-16s do finally arrive. They won't make any difference. But the other article is much more interesting, and it is an article, Plain Defense, Russia's New Strategy, and it is by Arman Mahmoudian. Now, this is a very strange article in some ways, because it continues to repeat many of the Western claims and myths about the war. It still talks about the Russians having exhausted their capabilities and eventually that they're in a war that they can't sustain, and that in an attrition war they will ultimately fail. But buried deep inside this article, there are these two paragraphs which I suspect tell us what this writer, this commentator, actually thinks. He says that Russia has one hidden objective by maintaining the defense and by building this extraordinary dense layer of fortifications through which the Ukrainians have failed to make breakthroughs. And the hidden objective is to buy time. Russia aims to hold back Ukrainian troops to provide its defense industry with the necessary time to rebuild its offensive capabilities after they were significantly degraded by poor decision-making in the early days of the war. I'm going to return to that topic shortly. Historically, Russia has frequently overcome its major adversaries by luring them into successive defensive belts. This tactic exhausts the enemy's equipment and manpower, allowing Russia to regroup and bolster its military. The strategy proved effective during confrontations like the Great Northern War, one fought by Peter the Great against Charles XII of Sweden, Napoleon's invasion in 1812, and Nazi Germany's Operation Barbarossa in 1941. In each scenario, Russia's defensive maneuvers smoothed the transition to an offensive posture. Anyway, let's now talk about that. Let's talk about what the Russians are doing. They are, and I think this is, by the way, absolutely correct. As I said, most of the rest of the article I don't agree with, but this is the tactic that the Russians have been following throughout this summer and the autumn. I would argue, by the way, that the Bakhmut operation of the winter and spring was the same. It was basically to grind the Ukrainians down, to use that expression, coined by General Surovikin all the way back in October. He, by the way, has now well and truly resurfaced. He's been visiting various African countries as part of Russian military delegations. It's not entirely clear what he's up to, but he's been visible in many photographs, and it does seem to me as if the Russian Defense Ministry is quietly preparing people for the fact that he might be back at some point. But anyway, I'm not going to divert myself by talking about General Surovikin in this program. But anyway, the point was, the Russians didn't just create this big defense line and all these fortifications in order, and that wasn't just the only thing they did, in order to wear the Ukrainians down, to exhaust the enemy's equipment and manpower, as this national interest article says. I think that the Bakhmut operation, the offensive on Bakhmut, was also very much, with hindsight, a part of that strategy, as was the offensive against Ukraine's energy system. It depleted, it exhausted Ukraine's air defense system, and it set the scene for other things. So that's the strategy. But what about the Russian build-up? Well, I think the first point I'm going to make is that there's been an interesting development on the battlefronts over the last couple of weeks on the Russian side, which is that whereas regular infantry were quite heavily involved in some of the fighting in the Bakhmut and Zaporozhye areas, and I want to stress some of the fighting in the kill zones, the area of control north and west of the big fortified lines. Most recently, most of the Russian troops who are continuing to fight in this area, this area of the zone of control, the kill zone, have been drawn from Russia's airborne forces, from the Donbass militia, which has clearly developed to a high degree over the course of the war, from various volunteer units, and there are other groups, somewhat like Wagner, but not exactly like Wagner, that are now also operational on the battlefields, and from the Chechen fighters. The regular infantry seem to have been pulled back. They were pulled back some weeks ago, back in August, from Rabotino, for instance, and they seem to be increasingly re-equipping. I should add, by the way, to that list, Russian Marines. It's elite forces, but relatively light forces. The heavy infantry, the mechanized infantry, and the tank forces are being husbanded and held back, and one wonders for what precisely. Well, Gordon Hahn, another outstanding scholar, has provided us with an overview of the situation in terms of what the Russians are now busy doing. He's provided an astonishing picture of the scale of the Russian build-up. If you want to read it, I believe it's on Substack. The article is called From Strategic Dilemma to Strategic Disaster, Part 1, by Gordon Hahn. And he's talking about a huge build-up of Russian forces, increasing numbers of units being created, large numbers of equipment being assembled, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, artillery, missiles. He talks about how the Russians have developed their forces and that they're increasing the numbers of their forces continuously and all the time. And the figures that he gives are pretty eye-watering if you actually look at them carefully. And I would say that they match very closely with that information I'm getting from that private source who's been talking to me about Russian production numbers. This person, as I said, puts Russian shell production at around 3 million a year at the present time, and he believes that within a few weeks it will be 3.5 million, and that this is still very much on a trend towards expansion. He says that tank production is also running very high. He also says that the Russians are producing around 250 new tanks a month. That article in the New York Times put it at 200 new tanks a year. This person says it's more likely to be 250 new tanks a month, together with 1,000 tanks, 750 tanks, modernized tanks, a month as well. So that would be around 15,000 new and modernized tanks coming off the 12,000 new and modernized tanks coming off the production lines a year at the present time. And this person also says that there is now plenty of scope to increase production rates still further. Manpower is the one major limiting factor. The Russians are working hard to try to automate processes to the extent that they can. And I noticed also that over the course of his interview in the Far East, Putin spoke about importing migrant workers from Central Asia, and he also spoke about I've already discussed the possibility that perhaps North Korean workers might be coming to Russia as well. Incidentally, I've also saw that a Ukrainian Telegram channel, Legitimy, which is quite critical of the Ukrainian government, it must be said, but which seems to be pretty well informed. It's actually floating a speculation that all the talk about shells coming to Russia from North Korea is actually cover for Chinese shells being supplied to Russia. In other words, that the Chinese have decided to provide the Russians with shells, large numbers of them. They would need to start new production lines to do that because, as I understand it, the Chinese military uses 155mm NATO caliber ammunition, not 152mm Soviet caliber ammunition. But there is no doubt at all that China could produce shells in staggering numbers, in any caliber, and pretty fast if it was minded to do so. Its industrial capacities dwarf those of any other industrialized country at the present time, including, by the way, the United States. So the suggestion that Legitimy is making is that, yes, the Russians are seeking to import shells. They're seeking to import them from China. The Chinese don't want to be seen publicly supplying shells to the Russians, and they're worried that that might, of course, open them up to secondary sanctions from the United States. So the agreement has been reached by the Russians, the Koreans, North Koreans, and the Chinese, that the Chinese will supply the shells, but the fiction will be preserved that these shells are not coming from China, they are coming from North Korea. Well, I mean, I don't know. I've no way of knowing. This is, it seems to me, speculation. It might just be mischief making. I can't comment on the truth of that report. But of course, if it is true, then any idea people in the West might have about attrition war becomes a fantasy, because there is no conceivable way that the West collectively could remotely hope to match not just Russian but Chinese production rates for shells brought together if these two countries are acting together. But anyway, that's one thing I have seen. But anyway, this person says that Russian production of shells will grow, and he also points out that the Russians are busy refurbishing old shells. He's provided some very interesting explanations about how this is done, of the production processes that have been used in order to do this, and that this is also making a significant difference in terms of the quantities of shells that the Russians are going to be able to obtain in the next few weeks and months. And this huge force is being put together, and it seems to me that the author in that national interest article is right. What the Russians did was that when they realized they were going to face a long war, they created their fortified lines, they prepared for the Ukrainian offensive, and just as the author of that national interest article says, they then mobilized their military industries and enlarged massively the size of their army until the purpose of the fortified lines was to buy them time and space in order to do that very thing. Now, I notice that Western officials are now increasingly talking about a long war. Jens Stoltenberg, who is the NATO Secretary General, is the latest person to do that. He's come out and said that the war will be long. The West must remain committed to supporting Ukraine throughout that long war, but he now seems to acknowledge that there isn't going to be a victory by Ukraine this year. The offensive is not going to succeed, but the priority now is to keep Ukraine fighting, and that there has to be a long war, and this is going to be a war of attrition, and the Western hope remains that this is going to wear the Russians out eventually. Now, I'm going to make a number of observations here. Firstly, Samuel Charap and his team at the RAND Corporation and in the Council for Foreign Relations warned way back in January that a long war in Ukraine was contrary to US interests. Stephen Myers, in that article in USA Today, is saying the same thing. He said that the long wars have unpredictable outcomes, and that the United States, far from weakening Russia, is becoming weakened itself and is becoming bogged down in this conflict in Ukraine. He's absolutely right. That is exactly what we're seeing happen. but it is what people like Stoltenberg are now saying. And the reasoning behind this commitment for this long wall is, in my opinion, becoming deeply alarming. My colleague and friend Alex Christoforou, who's just done a really good video in which he broadcast a clip of the interview, one of the recent interviews given by the German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock. And he pointed out that Baerbock, who is Germany's foreign minister, has also referred to Chinese leader Xi Jinping as a dictator, which doesn't seem to be at all a wise thing to do, given that China is a critically important trading partner for Germany, a Germany which is now deep in recession. But anyway, let's put that aside. I mean, Alex does a good job taking Baerbock apart on all of this. But the other thing which I found extraordinary about this article, about this interview by Baerbock, but which to my mind demonstrates very much the mindset, is that Baerbock was saying that we must support Ukraine because if we don't, if Ukraine is defeated, that will embolden other dictators like Xi Jinping. And in other words, Ukraine is being sacrificed, it is being destroyed, it is having to suffer all this enormous damage. There's another article that Jeff Roberts has linked to, it's too much, not enough time to discuss, but it talks about Ukraine's demographic death spiral, that Ukraine cannot absorb this kind of loss. We saw that article in the Daily Telegraph about the sagging morale and the Ukrainian soldier who said that Ukraine cannot absorb another year or two of this kind of loss. Anyway, all of this sacrifice is being done by Ukraine in order to deter the Chinese. It's not even about Ukraine. It's ultimately about Russia itself. It's about China. And this, again, reminds me of what the Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett has apparently said about the failure of the negotiations in Istanbul last year, the fact that the US and the British opposed the draft agreement that the Ukrainians had reached with the Russians at that time, which might have ended the war. Well, they opposed it because supposedly it would give a bad impression of Western weakness to China. So Ukraine is being destroyed on behalf of some sort of Western strategy against China. And going back to that extraordinary and very depressing speech that Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, gave at Johns Hopkins University. He talks about the League of Authoritarians. There's been so many articles, so much discussion in the United States fairly recently. There's that big article at the start of the Biden administration in the Atlantic Council, and a different kind of article, the article by Wes Mitchell in National Interest that I've spoken about as well. All of these articles, all these commentaries, all this debate about the importance for the United States of avoiding a two-front war, not getting finding itself in a position where it is taking on both potential adversary nuclear superpowers at one and the same time. China and Russia, taking them on at the same time. And Blinken is committing the United States to doing, in effect, exactly that. And we could see the strategic trap that is now causing. Ukraine is now on the best possible assumptions on the part of Western leaders. Ukraine is now in an attrition war. It can't win quickly. It is now facing a long war against an overwhelmingly more powerful enemy, which is getting stronger all the time. The West, however, must continue to support Ukraine in this attrition war, in this long war. It must fritter away its resources. It must send all the shells that it's building, all the missiles that it has, whatever tanks it has left. It must send dribs and drabs of air power to support Ukraine, because doing so would show weakness to China. Instead of avoiding a two-front war, the United States, if only by proxy, has now maneuvered itself into precisely that, and it can't escape it, at least according to this type of thinking, because doing so would show weakness not just to one adversary, the Russians, but to the other adversary, the Chinese as well. This is a disastrous way of thinking. It is the only route that it will lead to is ultimate strategic bankruptcy. If people in the United States acknowledge that a two-front war against China and Russia is a mistake, which many of them have done, then what is the United States doing? In effect, fighting one. Anyway, there we are. That's, it seems to me, where we are today. Now, there's a lot more that can be said. Baerbock, echoing Anglo-American sentiments, once more shows the extent to which European leaders have become penetrated, have become won over completely by American neocon thinking. In a recent program, Professor Sachs, Jeffrey Sachs, made the point that Josep Borrell got his notorious jungle simile about the outside world, outside the West, the jungle invading the garden, that he got it from none other than Robert Kagan, who's actually used that expression jungle as a title to one of his books, The Jungle Creeps Back. I haven't read it. And of course, Robert Kagan is the husband of Victoria Nuland, who so many people say is the ultimate begetter of this crisis in Ukraine, and of course who remains a prominent hardliner within the administration to this day. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that. And of course the other thing to keep in mind is that of course the West is talking about a long war, a war of attrition in Ukraine, one which perhaps lacks the resources to win, but it might not even get that. Daniel Davis spoke about a sudden collapse of the Ukrainian military. Gordon Hahn, whom I mentioned previously, his next article is apparently going to be Ukraine's ruin, which is perhaps another sign that, rather like Daniel Davis, he doesn't think that Ukraine will actually be able to sustain the kind of long war that many people in the West believe it can. I, by the way, strongly agree with that view. But anyway, this is where I end this program. It seems to me that we're now looking no longer for victory over Russia or a quick victory over Russia. We're talking about a long war, a war the Russians are prepared for and we are not. But anyway, that's me for today. More from me soon. You can find all our programs on our various platforms, especially Locals and Rumble, and before long, X, formerly known as Twitter. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can also go to our shop, get yourself the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day, and I'll speak to you again.